In today's video, I go over how I made my Lighthouse submission for the last ever Encounter Terrains 10x10 competition. For those of you who don't know, the 10x10 just references the base must be 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters, which is roughly 4 inches by 4 inches, with no actual requirement for height. And for my submission, I wanted to make a lighthouse. I had a cardboard tube which was roughly the same size that I wanted to make the lighthouse out of, so I chopped it at 6 inches. I wanted the lighthouse to be on the edge of a cliff, so I glued a plaster rock to the side. You're allowed to have a little bit of an overhang, so I gave it a little bit more scope and had it come over the edge just a little bit. I just used a little bit of foam core to clean up the sides and provide an area so I could put the ground texture on. For the ground texture, I ended up using Boyle Hobby Times method of using some plaster of Paris, some glue, and some paint. Mixed together in a smooth paste, just applied directly down that foam core. To knock down some of those spatula marks, I used a wet paintbrush and just stippled the surface. Once it was dry, I felt like it needed a little bit more texture, so I applied dirt via the stocking and a paint can lid method. With the ground texture done, I moved on to applying some texture to the lighthouse itself. For this, I just used some all-purpose joint compound. When working with joint compound, water is your friend. This stuff will stick to just about everything unless you wet it down first. And for that final texture, I just used a wet sponge and stippled the surface. Using a thin sheet of cork, I cut a small strip, gave the lighthouse a little extra dimension by adding a ring around it. I then went with painting the rocks. I just went with a simple gray base coat and followed it with some dry brushing of lighter and lighter gray, and then gave it a very dilute black wash. Once the wash was dry, I followed it up with a few more dry brushes of even lighter gray. Going back to the lighthouse, I then cut out the windows and doors and went about scratch building a door out of styrene. I followed this up by applying some glue to the ground texture so I could start applying the static grass. I ended up going with 3 coats to get the kind of coverage I was looking for. I wanted to go with a white and red color scheme for the lighthouse, so I applied the white base coat. I used some painter's tape to block out the stripe that was going to be spiraling up the lighthouse. I stippled on the red with a sponge, not really caring for full coverage because I wanted a worn look anyways. Following that, I painted the ocean a quick little blue color and made up some epoxy resin. Once the epoxy had cured and the lighthouse had dried, I then went to weathering the lighthouse. For this, I gave it 2 quick washes, one of a dustier sandy color, and another of a darker gray, almost concrete-like color to emphasize the aid. I then cut out a circle out of some styrene and found something that I could make the lighthouse lightroom out of. For this, it was just an old paint can lid, and for the lens, I ended up using this vial. I think it's for flowers. I'm not sure where I've had it. It was just been stuck in my parts bin forever, so good excuse to use it. I used some small square dowels for the uprights of some window frames. I then went about making a roof. This is actually the 3rd iteration of the roof I made. The first 2 both failed horrifically. So for this one, I just simplified it a little bit by creating some triangle shapes, gluing them all together so that the base was a hexagon and they all met at the top with some strips of styrene on each of the seams. While looking in my parts bin, I found this sprue left over from my T55 build from last summer, and I thought that this storage bin would look like a good door, so I took that off. It's not a hoarding problem if you actually have a use for it. Remember that. I glued the door in place and framed it with some more of that same styrene square dowel. And then off camera, I finished it off by adding a very finicky and delicate handrail around the perimeter of the catwalk. Then I gave it a coat of primer and followed that up with a rusty color because yes, I want to do some more chipping. Once the rusty brown color was dry, I followed that up with some chipping fluid and gave it a black coat of paint. Once the black was dry, I attacked it with some water and a brush. The goal is to softly poke and prod at the surface to reactivate that chipping fluid and pull up that paint. If you go too crazy with it, you could pull way too much off, which I did here in a couple spots. You can also use an old used airbrush needle or a toothpick or the edge of a hobby knife, just something sharp to help also create some scratch marks. Do be careful with that though, because you could easily go too far and go right through that primer layer and start showing, just going all the way through everything. I followed this up with cutting some clear plastic sheets for the windows of the Lightroom, and I used some super glue to glue in place. Following the windows, I glued the roof in place, and to match with the rest of the lighthouse, I followed it up with a very similar wash of the light sandy color and the same gray cement color. Keeping up with the theme of weathering, I went back to the main lighthouse portion and weathered it with some winter streaking grime. This is quickly becoming one of my favorite weathering products. I just love that green, grungy, nasty look it provides. After the weathering, I framed the windows and added some planks across some of them, and drilled some holes so I could create a little platform jutting out from one of the windows. I also went about making another platform, this time on the top of the lighthouse. All of this wood is aged via the Luke Towan method using some vinegar and steel wool. It is my go-to method for batch making a whole bunch of aged looking wood. I also added some plants at the bottom and some more defensive looking spikes around some of the windows and the ground. Speaking of the ground, I wanted to give it a little extra texture and some character, so I busted out some enamel paints. This time I used Mig's Earth as a darker tone, and followed that up with some Dry Earth from the Splashes range of Mig. I applied the lighter tone while the darker tone was still wet so we could take advantage of that wet blending method, just to help smooth out the transition between the two paints. I had made a little planter box that I had put on top of that upper platform, and I made some weeds or vines from some jute twine, unraveled, sprayed with some hairspray, and sprinkled on with some fine turf from Woodland Scenics. I painted up and chipped some barrels that I placed on that upper platform as well. Focusing back down on the water, I wanted to make some crashing waves, or at least some turbulence in the water. So I used some snow flocking from Woodland Scenics and some glue and just mixed a little bit of a paste up. To fit the theme of the build, which was the last stand for honor and glory, I needed to have a villain, or at least an antagonist for the piece. And that's when I found this shark chimera. All I know is I wouldn't want to mess with it. Just saying. So I chose to paint it after a great white shark. For the paint job, all I did was I blocked in the base colors, followed those up with some highlights, and then gave a couple washes. I definitely need some more practice, but you know, I'm hopefully improving. With him finished up, I painted and added a smaller protagonist figure and naturally added him off screen. And with that, the only thing that was left to do was knead up the edges with a coat of black paint, and this one was done. If you guys made it this far, thank you guys so much for watching. The next video on the channel I'm actually super stoked for. I got a really fantastic opportunity to work with someone super talented, and it involves a subject matter that I've never covered on my channel before, and I've actually never even delved into before on my own. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like what you saw and you want to see some more, click right here. And if not, I'll catch you in the next one.